So thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to UKIS. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to talk about conversation analysis and conversation design, conversational technologies, conversational products across 5 different areas. So these are the things that I'm going to walk us through. So first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with conversation analysis, I'll start with what is conversation analysis. And as conversational technologies become more and more something that people talk about and ask me about, I do feel the need sometimes to say conversation analysis is not conversational analysis. As my colleague Charles Antarchy said, it's the conversation that is analysable, not the analysis that is conversational. So it's conversation analysis, this thing that I do. And then I'll talk briefly about how and where is conversation leveraged, and then what does it mean to be conversational, at least from the point of view of a conversation analyst. And then I'm going to focus all of my examples of the points that I want to make and discussions and issues to raise around requesting. So how we ask for things, and how asking for things is a little bit more complicated than we think. And then I'll end with some problems and maybe moonshots for the future in this space between conversation analysis and conversational products and technologies. And then I'll answer the question about how conversational these things actually are. So to start with then, what is conversation analysis? It's a field that originates in sociology. I'm a psychologist by background, but it comes from sociology. It's 6 decades of cumulative science of human sociality. It's a theory of human sociality as well as a tool and method for understanding social interaction. And unlike a lot of psychology, which is my home discipline, conversation analysis's USP is to study human sociality in the wild. So maybe like David Attenborough, we don't stick people in laboratories to observe what they do in laboratories and then extrapolate. And we also don't interview people later or ask them on surveys about their interaction. We look at real interaction as it happens in the wild. And maybe another way of thinking about what conversation analysts do, given that we're in football territory, is to think about us constantly looking at recordings of play and then sort of scrutinising how a turn of conversation goes from this player to this player to this player, and then if the conversation is effective, maybe it goes in the back of the net or maybe it's a disaster. And we've probably all been in both of those types of conversations many times. So yes, we're looking at real conversation as it happens in the wild, not simulated, not role-played, not experimentally produced, not reported upon post hoc in surveys or interviews. And so our primary data are recordings. So we work with sometimes single cases, sometimes tens, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of cases of actual interaction as it happens. We then look at the recording in terms of a really technical transcript that is designed to enable us to look at not just what is said, the words uttered, but also the way things are said, the pace with which they're said, the intonation with which things are delivered. And if you're looking at video materials, then you might be augmenting your transcript with all sorts of things about gaze, gesture, the sustaining of a gesture, the movement, body, and all of those things as well. All of the resources that we have, things in the material environment and so on, that we're using to interact. So this is conversation analysis in a kind of nutshell. In terms of where this word, how I got to this question, like how is conversation itself leveraged? So about 2008, thereabouts, I started to develop what was probably quite unpopular with colleagues in the sort of pure end of my field at the time, at least, a kind of communication training approach based on some research that I'd been doing at the time. So at the time, I'd finished a project looking at neighbour disputes. Because I'm a conversation analyst, I didn't really want to interview people about their neighbour disputes or try to get them in a lab and say, pretend to have a neighbour dispute, I'm gonna record what happens there. Instead, I was trying to identify places where people's neighbour relationships were at stake, but where there were the sort of natural habitat for them and that I could capture and study them. And so I started to collect recordings and analyse people in community mediation, telephone calls into community mediation. I also looked at calls to environmental health services, calls to the local council and police interviews with people who'd been arrested in neighbour disputes gone nuclear. So I had all of these data sets, very interesting, lots of things to say about neighbour relationships and their escalation. And also I got more and more interested in how do these different professional parties deal with neighbour disputes, everything from mediators who are impartial, if you like, through to the police who can, stick your neighbour in prison, which, to be fair, is what most people want. And so I got especially then interested in these initial inquiry calls into community mediation services, where people would phone up and say something like, I've just called the police and they've given me your number, or I've just phoned a lawyer and they've given me your number, or I've just phoned the council and they've given me your number. And so people were phoning up this service, community mediation, with a problem that right from the start you could see wasn't ideally in their head going to be solved by, let's get you together to talk to this person that you loathe, that lives next door, that you want arrested, evicted, I want them burned, I want them killed. Let's mediate. And so these conversations, these initial inquiries, quite often went really badly for the mediator because they were more or less effective at getting people through to the end of the call with a yes at the end. And so this became really interesting, and because I was working with lots of mediators and kind of appreciated the work they were doing, I thought, well, I can see points along this initial inquiry conversation where callers become more engaged with the possibility of becoming a client and actually quite resistant to the idea of becoming a mediation client. And so I started to identify, describe, and share back with the mediators not anything that I was recommending, but things that they were doing, that if they knew they were doing it, it wasn't written down anywhere. And when they were training people to be a mediator, it wasn't in any of the training. And also, presumably, given how many of the mediators were not able to convert callers into clients, some of these things were just, they couldn't even think maybe reflectively on what is working in these calls if you assume that they did want to get clients. And so, for example, one of the things that I found was mediators always had to explain what mediation was at some point in that initial inquiry. Some ways of explaining were more effective than others. But again, you have to assume that the mediators didn't realise that they were explaining mediation in a way that was putting people off, because otherwise they wouldn't do it. So on that basis, I just started to tentatively share some of these findings and develop a technique for getting people to live through real encounters, so not hypothetical scenarios, but actual encounters with live potential clients to see the sort of impact of how they were interacting on the telephone. Because of this sort of slow development into where can I take my research findings, identify and describe and share what is effective and less effective in whatever encounter I got interested in, I then started to be interested in what am I the alternative to? So how do people typically do this kind of training? And so what I started to realise is that almost all communication training is based on role play and simulation and hypothetical scenarios. And so I started to ask the question, well, how authentic is role play? Does it effectively mimic the thing that it's meant to mimic? And I guess the answer to that question is, well, we'll see at least one answer to it later. But at the time as well, there was hardly any research on role play, at least anything past you've just been in a role play, did it feel authentic? Or you've just been in a role play, you role played with an actor playing the part of a patient, let's say we're in doctor-patient territory now, and you went in a role play and you role played with a nurse playing the part of a patient, and you role played with somebody else playing the part of a patient. Which one felt most authentic? But people were not doing a comparison between the data, which is actually quite hard to get, which is the real thing, and then what was going on in the role play. So I'll come back to that a bit later. So I started to think at this point, where is conversation feeding into products like communication training or assessment tools or diagnostic instruments or any other kind of product where some version of conversation is now being productized, and then it might be actually affecting people's lives in ways that we are totally unaware of. And so what does it mean to be conversational? So conversational is a really old word. if you go back to the OED, you'll find its first use was something like 1790s, something like that. And then it kind of drifted out of use, and there's lots of interesting versions like conversational and things like that are really interesting old words that we don't use anymore. And then, of course, around about the 1960s and onwards, it became, if you go on just Google and look at the n-grams, you'll see how rapidly the term has escalated. What do we mean, though, when we use the word conversational? We probably mean something like maybe informal or casual or not precise or not written speech. We have all sorts of things that that stereotypically pop into our heads when we think about what conversational is. But I want to think about it a little bit differently from the perspective of conversation analysis. And so another relevant bit of background to this presentation is my first sort of foray into the world of conversational technology. As an industry fellow at Typeform, you've probably all at some point filled in a Typeform. It's an online data collection tool, a bit like SurveyMonkey, but sort of optimized for lots of different types of data collection. And the team at Typeform got in touch and said, we're conversational. We're not really sure what that means, though, or we'd like to really dig into what it means to be conversational. They were trying to move away from forms, filling in forms, to a sort of question-by-question elicitation of data. And so I went and worked there for 6 months, and I'll show you just a couple of examples of the things that we started to move away from and move towards. And then a few years later, I escaped from academia again and to spend some time with another startup, this time platform called Deployed. And again, here a lot of my focus was on things like, how do you ask better questions? What do we know from conversation analytic research, my own, but actually mostly other people's, to sort of bring all that together and think, how do we develop better question flows? Because if you've got better questions, then you've got better answers, and therefore you've got better data. So one of the studies that is not my study, it's research by John Heritage and colleagues, but was sort of very instructive, I think, for people thinking about conversational, moving away from sort of personas and sentiment and emojis and casual and informal, but something more structured, actually, more sort of machinery oriented. And that's this form here. So this is a form that health visitors took to visit new parents with. And their job in that interaction is to sort of fill in the form with the new parents in front of them. And Heritage and colleagues were interested in, here's a form, and how do people actually sort of deliver the form? And so I'm going to zoom in a minute. Just on the right-hand side there, you've got a technical conversation analytic transcript. Don't worry about the detail, just sort of see that, of course, immediately it's turned into speech, so it's looking quite different. But what was especially interesting was how people don't say things like, if we just zoom in on these items here, they don't say things like birth information, pregnancy, normal/abnormal, and wait for a response. That isn't how it works. And they don't say type of delivery and wait to see, they don't formulate anything like that and tell me, give me something to put in the box. They have to turn it into conversation. And so for me, this is very interesting for anyone trying to develop form-based or written sequences, because we can see, how do people do it? Because there's lots of situations in lots of different settings and contexts where talking like a form is exactly the task in hand. And so we want to see what that might look like, turn by turn, sequence by sequence. And so you can see things like, and you had a normal pregnancy, which is already optimized for a particular type of response. For a start, it doesn't really sort of give you that sort of balanced one or the other. It doesn't list options. It just proposes something about the person. Of course, at this point, probably the health visitor knows something about the person, so they can safely formulate it in that way. And then, and a normal delivery, yep. And so we see this way in which the health visitor moves through this question, and here, that's great. And then this one, yep. This one, and they connect these questions in sequences by just putting an and preface at the start, as you can see here. And so one of the things that we started to look at Typeform was how do you connect things so that whoever is filling in the form has an expectation that I'm going to get 3 questions which are kind of connected to each other. So moving away from things like, what is your name? What is your email address? What is your X? What is your Y? Instead we would go, what's your name and your email and something else, thanks. And just start to just sequence them up like that so that you're driving people through the encounter in a conversational way, by which I mean any humans having interactions are going to be conversational, so let's see how people actually do this task. So this is a type of request, getting people's information out of them, and so I'm going to come on to request in a little bit more detail, but let me show you something else about this email question that is interesting, I think. So as soon as you put something into a product with written text, like and your email, it's kind of there. So once you've decided that is the design of your elicitation, then it's static, it's there. But of course, there was a little bit of conversation yesterday about how do you personalize things for different recipients. And we know that in real social interaction, institutional encounters and so on, people are sometimes asked the same question in the same way every time, but also we see turns being designed for particular recipients. So in conversational analysis, we would call this recipient design. So I just want to compare 2 clips. So here's one just without audio, just to give you a sense of what this might look like in a transcript. So we see, this is somebody asking, I can't remember the context, sales context, something like that. And what's your email address? And then the person, they do a little lip smack, and then an and then an and then they start reeling off their email address, susanderson@ blah, blah, blah. So this question, and what's your email, presumes that it's kind of got a built-in presupposition that it's not a problem to supply an email next. And typically that is what you see when whoever is asking, eliciting the information, has whatever they are learning about the person turn by turn, every turn is data in a way. They've reached this point of the encounter and they think, this person's probably got email. They're not really thinking this, it's too fast for that, but whatever it is, it means I can just say, what's your email? And it's not going to be a problem to supply the email. But let's compare this to another way of asking about email. Hopefully the audio is now going to work. So you're going to hear the audio come out in sync with the transcript. The audio will sound a little strange because I've changed the pitch to anonymise the voices a little bit. And I've also taken away any other identifying features in terms of names and so on. So here it comes, and this is at a holiday sales company. Okay, so do you have an email address at all? That's quite different from saying, what's your email? So here we see someone designing the request, taking out the presupposition that the person they're talking to will have email, and making it easy for the person to say no if they don't have email, which they don't have email. And then in just one of those really gorgeous little moments that you sometimes see in interactions, not only does the salesperson sort of design their request fitted to the person that they think they're talking to, they use this opportunity to just have a little moment of affiliation. It's more trouble than it's worth, isn't it? Ha ha, yes, and they have a little laugh together. Even more interesting, I think, is you can see that my transcript starts at line 6. So let's see what happened just before we get to this way of asking email to this person. And in the bigger paper that we have done, Marie Flinkfelt, Sophie Parslow and myself, we started to look at things like voice quality. So to be really crude about it, if someone sounds very old, how are they asked about email? Or if someone sounds very old and they're asking about eligibility for a type of service, do we need to check their age, or are we using the cues of their voice to offer them the thing that they've asked for without going into other sorts of checks? So how are people using voice quality on the phone to do things, but also how are they not always just going by voice quality, because turn by turn by turn by turn by turn, they're realising that if I ask the question this way at this point, it'll feel patronising, because it's also clear that this person might sound old, but they're also, clearly tech savvy from other things they've told us in the conversation. But let's just see what happens building up to this question. So what has just happened is that as part of this sequence of getting information out of the person who is going to buy a holiday from us today, the salesperson asks for the telephone number. And you might notice that the person doesn't say 07, they say 01. And if you say 01, then you're a landline user, not a mobile user. And so this is the kind of tiny little things that if you're a decent conversationalist, if you're effective in your listening to people and really doing that personalization thing that we might call it personalization in sort of tech world, then you're able to pick up and maybe design your request for email for somebody who is using a landline, even though they haven't said I'm a landline user, but you can pick up on these kinds of things if you're really listening. Okay, so asking for things is more complicated than you think. You can't just say, what's your email? You can, and that might be fine, as long as you know the person that you're talking to isn't going to have to say something like, actually, I don't have internet. Or things like, have you got a mobile? Oh, actually, I've got no credit. And things where you build in a presupposition about the person and it ends up being problematic for all sorts of reasons that we might not immediately think about. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you now a bunch more requests, different types of requests in which people are all asking for something, but they're all asking for it in different ways. So what you'll see is that not only are the way people making their request different grammatically, they are designed with a different sense of entitlement, a different sense of urgency, and a different level of knowledge about the thing that they're asking for. And all of those bits of information are there in the request. So hopefully you'll see the difference. So the first one, again, it's going to sound very muffled. It's very heavily anonymised for various reasons, this one. But it's a patient calling the GP surgery asking, could I have an appointment to see Dr. Wilkinson, please? Okay, here's another patient, different call, upping the urgency of their request. So could I have is a type of request. It's a yes-no interrogative, but it carries with it the action of a request. The person, unlike my mediators from before, the person knows what they can get from this service. They don't say, is this, what is a doctor? Or, I've just been given this number and apparently you do medicine. Or they don't start that way. They start knowing the thing that they're asking for. But here's another one where maybe the urgency is sort of encoded and upgraded. I need to make an appointment as soon as, please. Okay, now let's see a call to the vet. So here's somebody phoning about their pet, their cat. So here we have a slightly less entitled kind of request, so not I need, but I was just wondering, I wonder if it's possible. The urgency is like not imminent because it's about tomorrow, and then we also get the reason for making the request. My cat's had an operation, so we get, again, loads of information is embedded now in this request. Here's the start of another different call to the holiday sales company that we saw a minute ago. Okay, so again, here we don't actually have the request yet. So we don't really know yet what the contingency is. We don't really know whether the person knows about the company they're calling, but we do know that they're having difficulty accessing the service online. So, but we don't know what's urgent and so on because we haven't actually reached the base request yet. So we've got something that is like a precursor, we call them a pre-sequence to the request. And here's another one. This is now a call to mediation that I mentioned before. It's the kind of thing that you see at the start of a call to mediation. So I've just phoned somewhere else. I phoned somewhere that gives free legal advice. That tells you something about the kind of thing that I think is going to solve my problem. And they've given me your number. You do mediation service or something. So someone who, again, we haven't reached the request yet. We don't really know what they want. We know that they don't know about the service that they're calling. So you start to see a huge range of things that can happen when somebody in an organisation picks up the phone and says, how can I help? And then a whole bunch of things can happen. And so if we think about the and your email as a sort of static request for an email address, we can start to think about how do service providers, both on the telephone but in chatbots or on all sorts of apps and so on, how are they eliciting requests from people? And are they thinking about all of the different things that can happen in that very first slot that is filled by the person making a request? And instead what we typically find is that these requests, both spoken and on things like chatbots, they start this way and they provide this invariant and static way of eliciting something from people every time. And so here, this is from a bank, DNB Bank. I have no special interest in DNB Bank except that they are very boastful about the AI chatbot agent. So I thought, well, let's have a look at that. It is quite fun to break a bot. And it's going to break quite quickly. So what happens next? So if we then think about what happens next, and I just do versions of the kinds of things that we see people actually saying in response to, can I help? So I'm a lady of a certain age and going online is giving me a headache, as an example we just saw, and then a version of the Citizens Advice Bureau one. I've been given your website by a friend, you do bank services or something. Let's see what happens next. Nothing useful. It's just frustrating things happen next. And so one thing that is interesting to organisations that have chatbots is we'd like people to stay on the chatbot, we don't really want them to go on the phone, but how do we know what is it? Are people even eyeballing a chatbot and thinking, that's not going to work? Because they're already seeing something about the likely way in which that either even the elicitation itself or the very first thing that happens next, what's going to happen if people just exit the chatbot and give up. So let's think about the way in which requests and other sorts of actions get done. So what I'm hoping you're starting to see is that people don't just ask for things, typically. They have to build up to them, or it's complicated, or they add accounts into them, or contingencies, or urgency, or how much they know about the thing that they're asking for. And all of that you can find in, like one thing that people say. And we can start to put this into a sort of architecture of how sequences of interactions typically unfold. So this is just an invented example of an invitation. How do you make an invitation? So here's someone saying, want to go to the cinema, yeah, great. You can see that in my fake transcript, this is lines 3 and line 6. So what's happening? What else is happening here? And what do we call these things? So here is just a really, what we might call a base action. It's an invitation, it's issued, it's responded to, there's nothing else happening. And we call these things in the conversation sort of paired turns, so we call them an adjacency pair. You get the first bit, the second bit, and things work in these paired type ways, progressing smoothly through the encounter. But of course, there's lots of occasions where you don't just ask, you don't just invite, you do other work to sort of ensure that the interaction flows as smoothly as possible and without having to, for example, issue an invitation where someone's going to have to say no. Because if you issue an invitation, ideally someone says yes, not no. So how do you design it so that you don't have no's ending up in the world? You do stuff like this, and we call these pre-sequences. So what are you up to this evening? Nothing much. So if someone says, what are you up to this evening? And then the person says, I'm going out for dinner. You probably then don't say, do you want to go to the cinema? Because you could, and then it's the kind of thing that finds its way into comedy scripts, and people are like, well, what do you mean? That's kind of weird now. And it can be funny, but it can also just be weird. And then you might do something that we would call an insert expansion. So you might say, what's on? Like, I'm not saying yes straight away, I want to know what's on. An Alfred Hitchcock film, Vertigo. And then once you've got your yes, great, you might also then do a little bit more and complete this sort of 8-line sequence now with what we call a post-expansion, where you're just doing another couple of pairs of turns. And now we have the invitation sequence. It's been built up to, it's been expanded in the middle, it's been expanded at the end, but the core sort of action all the way through is clear. So if we think about this in connection to requests and how it is that people nevertheless manage to handle this invariant occasion for asking, so there's the chatbot version. Let's see on the telephone now, these are all calls from Double Glazing Sales and Windows company, and they pretty much answer the phone the same way every time. They only vary whether they say good morning or good afternoon. So let's see how these calls, when someone picks up the phone, typically starts like this. And I've anonymised them as top glaze windows. So let's just think about those base actions. So things that aren't expanded, there's no complication in that sense. People just say the thing they want when they're asked to say the thing they want. And here's an example of that. Okay, so nothing special happening there. You just got this base. Tell me what you need, and I'm going to tell you what I need. Here's also something happening in that position. We sort of get to a request, but it's very messy, very hard to follow. Let's see what you make of this one. Let's see actually what the speechmatics makes of this one as well.
How much you after basically it's to the rental property, so obviously it's not what I would be, and obviously what kind of people will to start,
Oh, crikey, yeah. The transcription's pretty good though. Okay, so let's now think, so we've got this kind of idea that we can design our interactions for a base. We can ask somebody and they'll kind of tell us what they want, or in a very messy way they might eventually get to what they want. But we might see that things happen well before you get to the base. So here are some examples of people doing things that are in that sort of loosely pre-expansion environment before you get to the base at all. So here's somebody starting with a pre-account for calling. So I'm just going to check if you do the thing that I want before I launch my base request. So again, the first thing that happens isn't the request, it's something else. And here's a couple more examples.
Windows, yeah? Windows. Yeah. Just inquiring, I've been on the internet yesterday.
Okay, so checking that I'm in the right place, and then here's another one, a bit similar.
Hi there,
Okay, so finding the right organisation. So even though you think this is like unlikely to happen online, it also happens online where people are, they've phoned the number, they found the number, but they still want to know, are you the number that I actually phoned? And it's the same on chatbot type interaction where people are in the chatbot, they're on the website, but they still want to know, am I in the right place? Something about the site, the number, something is not making people immediately trust and know that they're in the right place. Let's go to the other side and think about other things that can happen which are kind of after that base request might happen. So the first thing that might happen is something like this, a kind of augmented request. You might have, so I've made my request, but I want to add a knocker. Very common when you're calling the double glazing people. You might have this, which is like a contingent request, something's happened, and now you need to just slightly tweak the thing that you've asked for.
Hi, and I've got an appointment booked tonight at 5 o'clock, there's a month commander, and there's a Bible for me. And I'm struggling to get back, and I'm kind of resonated tonight.
Okay, so all that work done before they say the main reason that they're calling, which is I'm not going to be able to make it. They don't ask to rearrange. What happens typically now is that people say I'm struggling to get back, and that what happens is an offer. So they haven't actually requested a change of appointment time, but they've described a situation, and the salesperson, if they're listening at least, will pick up on that and just offer another time. And then we've got other sorts of things that might happen in these slots. So first of all, a burden in which somebody, you'd imagine, wouldn't have to make this kind of call. So here's someone who's going to be a client, but they're having to chase the people to come round and start the sort of sales transaction bit. And here's somebody phoning with a complaint. Okay, you could totally write a sitcom or something from these calls. Okay, so we start to basically see that there's a lot of things that can happen when you pick up the phone and say, good afternoon, the name of the company, or can I help you? It might not be the case that people just give you the base request, the thing that you might want them to sort of to start with, a sort of straightforward way. But one of the things that I've been talking about with these companies that are interested in conversation analysis is, especially people designing interactions this way, is if you only ever design for the base, then you're just missing a whole bunch of things that more typically happen actually when you start an encounter with a client or a prospective client. There's a whole load of other things that you might need to deal with and have at least make sure that your chatbot or whatever else is actually able to recognise these other kinds of actions that typically happen at the start of encounters. So the next example is a little bit different. We're still at the vets. I'm going to play you two different calls into the vet. And let's just say something about these two different ways of making a request when you call the vet.
Hello, it's possible to make an appointment for my cat tomorrow for my operation.
So you probably remember that one from a few slides back. Here's another one. Okay, so one of these calls is not like the other one. One of them is a mystery shopper role-playing the part of being the owner of a pet. And their task is to phone the surgery or phone whichever organisation has employed them, and report back on the service experience that they had. And from a distance, they look very similar, mystery shoppers and the real pet owners. So, and if you're not expecting, like the callers, the people at the vets don't know that they're going to have a mystery shopper call, so from their point of view, they can't identify them either. They sound kind of similar. And this is a study that I did about 5 years ago now, and this came after the first time I tried to investigate the difference between role-played and actual encounters, where I looked at police interviews with real suspects, and then I looked at police interviews in training where they interacted with actors playing the part of suspects. And the thing that I focused on was how, at the start of the interviews, in both cases, the police delivered the law. So basically they go through the items of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, introduce themselves, remind people of their rights to free and independent legal advice. And given that this is all written down, my question was, how different can it be when you're turning written text into spoken interaction that's in the law, but you're doing it for real or you're doing it in role play? And the answer is quite different. They're quite different. A few years later, I had this other opportunity to look at the authenticity or fidelity of role play, which was this study. So I'd already done the research on the real calls to the vets, and I also looked at the mystery shopper calls. And when you look at research about mystery shoppers, you don't find anything at all on its authenticity. Instead, what you find is the results of mystery shoppers who report back and say, I just went to a pharmacist and the pharmacist didn't do any of the checking that they should do when they're giving me these drugs. And that's pretty much what you find in the mystery shopping literature, the problem with pharmacies. But no one's looking at the mystery shoppers and how they're asking for the drugs. And I think, well, it might be kind of interesting to see what do mystery shoppers do when they ask for drugs. I didn't have that data, but I did have this data. And so you might see, and you might have been thinking now, well, which one is which? And you might think you know which one it is, and you might also then think how confident you are about knowing that as well. But the first one is the real person who actually got a cat, and the other person is someone who doesn't actually have a new puppy. So what we found, we looked at a decent-sized data set, comparing both, and found that basically mystery shoppers who are role-playing pet owners make requests for different things. So real pet owners typically phone up to make an appointment, whereas mystery shoppers typically phone up to find out about the cost of a service. Now, real pet owners do also phone up about the cost of a service, but not as much. And once they're told the cost of a service, they typically make an appointment. Whereas the mystery shopper, when told what the price of the service is, they don't ask for an appointment, leaving the vet receptionist in a slightly weird position of saying, would you like to book an appointment? And they say, oh, I'll maybe call back tomorrow. And, I haven't really got a pet, so no, I'm not going to be doing that. But it's quite weird because what the mystery shopper doesn't do is give the very basic kind of service task of let's find a mutual date. Let's navigate the diary system, which is a really common thing to have to do. And they also then don't give the vet receptionist the task of having to cancel or rearrange an appointment or respond to somebody who's had really bad or is about to have really bad news about their animal. So we do get mystery shoppers phoning to ask about euthanasia for their pet, and we don't have time to get into it now, but when you see the difference between a mystery shopper playing the part of someone whose animal is about to die and someone who has got an animal that is actually about to die, you start to see how bad we are at simulating being other humans. We just do what you might imagine that looks like, but it isn't actually what it looks like. So other things that you might spot here in terms of differences, and some of these things you think, well, it's not that important. I think it is important because when you start to generate conversational speech in systems and you're not really looking at how people are really doing things, then first of all, you're just missing a trick, but also you might be doing something that is doing some damage to the people whose communication you're either training or evaluating or whatever it might be. So mystery shoppers make shorter calls, they refer to their pets differently, so real callers will typically they'll use the possessive pronoun, my cat, my dog, they'll give the name of their animal as well, they might give the breed. So they do all those sorts of things differently. They supply different information, real pet owners to mystery shoppers, and they even initiate self-repair differently. So real callers are more likely to go before the type of service that they're asking about, whereas mystery shoppers are more likely to go before the type of animal they're asking about. And yet they are still going to report on customer experience anyway, even though no one is scrutinising what they are doing as mystery shoppers, because we just think, well, people can simulate being humans because we have our lifetime's anecdata about how we all talk to each other. Might not be the case. Yet we find claims like this all over the place, which are very interesting. So one of them is like from 10 years ago, where I got into trouble with role-play organisations who said, you're going to put us out of business because you're saying we're not authentic. And now, of course, 10, 11 years later, we have the same kinds of claims made about AI-augmented role-play actors and scenarios and so on. So let's finish in the last 5 minutes or so by trying to look at requests in a different way and comparing people making requests and trying very hard to prompt LLMs to do the same kind of task. So here, first of all, is Donnie and Marcia. It's the first start of a 30-second conversation. Who Donnie and Marcia are to each other should become sort of reasonably clear, or maybe not that clear, but in the first, you'll see what they're not and you'll see what they might be, and you can guess at the kind of relationship they might have. Donnie's phoning Marcia because his car has broken down. Okay, so what's going to happen next is that Donnie never asks for a lift because people typically don't go for that base action when they're making requests like this. They describe a problem. and then the person they're calling, it's their job to make an offer. In this particular case, Marcia can't make an offer because she's about to go out, so he never asks, and she never says no, but in 30 seconds they realise what that was. They know what that was. So with my colleague Saul Albert, we have been taking some of these classic conversations and seeing what LLMs make of them. So in the transcript you're about to see and hear now, we've included Marcia's voice where the same words were produced by the LLM, and everything else we've just used some version of text-to-speech.
This is Marcia speaking. How may I assist you? How can I assist you? Is there something specific you need help with? Oh, I'm not very good at guessing things. Didn't win a contest or receive some good news. Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Dummy, that must be frustrating. Are you in a safe location? Is there anything I can do to help?
Okay, this keeps going for 3 minutes. And of course it is kind of funny, but you see the sort of gigantic gradient of like how rapidly an LLM is able to pick up on things that we would see as a pre-account, urgency. You can't sort of use the placement of turns to do that sense of pace and breathiness and this is quick and that's urgent and so on, and a whole bunch of other things as well. So to finish, I've got one more clip that I want to play, and then I'll wrap it up. So let's think about this in the context of challenging encounters where humans do it amazingly well, and then we have to ask ourselves, how would you get this to be some kind of automated, if that was what people were after, some kind of automated thing. So let's just start with somebody using this particular line that I'm going to show you across 3 transcripts, but first of all, asking Siri on a smartphone.
I'd like to order pizza for delivery.
Okay, here's what I found.
So I'd like to order pizza for delivery, and a bunch of pizza delivery service pops up. Okay, now let's look at a completely different environment, and you're going to hear a 911 call. And the thing that I just want you to focus on, because we don't have time to linger on it in a lot of detail, is the placement of the turns that the caller is making, because it's the overlap that is key to what is going on in this call, which is very hard to sort of transcribe, never mind then start to sort of figure out why is this the relevant thing that is making this call go in a particular direction and not another one. So here it comes. Okay, so again, I'm not going to play to the end, but what this is and turns out to be is a real call. It's a real victim of domestic violence. The husband is there. There's a weapon. How do you sound like I'm just calling for pizza to the person who is in the house, whilst also sounding like a genuine caller to the person taking the call? And this is why sometimes context itself isn't going to get you there, because one of the main tasks of people in dispatch centres like this, just because they're calling the police and you have the context, doesn't mean to say that you're going to be treated like a serious caller to the police. In fact, sifting out malicious, hoax, nuisance, not serious, all sorts of other reasons that people call the police is a main task of dispatchers. So just because you're calling the police doesn't mean that I'd like to order a pizza for delivery is going to be treated one way or the other. It has to be something else. And when we start to look at more calls where we know the outcome, we see that overlaps and the placement of turns are key to hear me sounding like some other type of interaction, rather than the thing that you might be worried it is. And to finish, I'm just going to show you the same thing with an LLM.
What's more? I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you said. Can you please repeat your message and provide more information about the emergency? I'm sorry, but this is not a pizza delivery service. For people who require immediate assistance from the police, fire department, or medical services, please refrain from making non-emergency calls to this line to ensure that our lines remain available for those who require urgent help. Is there anything else I can assist you with? I apologize for the confusion, but as I mentioned earlier, this is not a pizza delivery service. Calling 911 for non-emergency purposes is not only inappropriate but also illegal. Please refrain from doing so in the future, and only use this line to report emergencies that require immediate assistance from the police, fire department, or medical services. Do you have any actual emergency that you need help with?
Okay, so I'm going to leave it there with that thought and answering this question about how conversational are these conversational products and technologies. And the answer is, I think, something like, well, only as conversational as those other products and technologies and services where conversation is leveraged in sometimes interesting, sometimes very strange, and sometimes rather damaging sorts of ways. Thanks.